Hi, my name is Ali. Let's explore TCE using Merlin for Tanzu Kubernetes. So when we say TCE, what do I mean? TCE actually stands for Tanzu Community Editions, and Merlin for TCE Kubernetes is a Docker-based utility tool that will help simplify some of the processes during the Kubernetes installation using TCE. So what's inside TCE? So TCE comprises of a fair bit of OSS, and what I'm going to focus on the component of TCE is the compute runtime, which is based off of Kubernetes. And there are a few others that's included in there, but I will touch on those things in a future video. So what I will do, I'll quickly go to the microsite of TCE. So it's a tool created, contributed. It's a tool created by VMware and contributed by the open source community. And there is a GitHub repository of TCE as well. So if I go in there, so that's the TCE open source project, and we can explore a little bit more in there. But there's a lot going on in TCE, but as I mentioned, I'll focus on particularly the Kubernetes section. Okay, so a couple of things that I should mention is about Tanzu Community Editions feature. It's it's a complete and customizable Kubernetes platform, right? So anything that we need to run a container application or deploy a containerized application on the Kubernetes, TCE has got all that expert covered. It's free and it is multi-cloud. So when I say multi-cloud, it supports Tanzu Kubernetes own VMware environment, or that means vCenter. On AWS, native AWS, it doesn't have to be VMC on AWS. On Azure, native Azure as well, and on Docker, when you're running things on your laptop. So what I am going to do today is actually deploy the Kubernetes component on vSphere environment. So very briefly, as I mentioned, TCE is free, open source, multi-cloud Kubernetes platform. It automates the creation process of Kubernetes cluster on a given platform, on a given infrastructure, whether that's vSphere, Azure, or AWS, or Docker on your local machine. It handles the lifecycle management of Kubernetes cluster as well. So as you know, the Kubernetes version, you are running on version 1.9, you want to upgrade to 1.21, then yeah, with TCE, this is super simplified. And it uses open source technologies for other operation aspects of Kubernetes clusters, like Pinniped for authentication, Velero for backup, OPA for policy management, and so on. One important concept before we dive into what how you would get TCE running on your vSphere environment is TCE actually has two aspects to it. One is management cluster, the other one is workload cluster. So management cluster is typically used by a platform operator. So what that means, the first time when you want to have a Kubernetes feature on your vSphere platform, you would use Tanzu CLI to start a UI to deploy a management cluster. And then you will create a declarative YAML file, declarative definition of your workload cluster. That's where your actual application or container will run, and supply that to Tanzu CLI and execute a command against the management cluster, which will deploy the workload clusters, right? So it's a distributed, in a way, it's like distributed system, right? So you are interacting with one plane, and then you are telling it to do other things. So that's the workloads cluster, or TKC. the end users or the engineers, they will use the TCE, right, or workload cluster. So that's where your application will go, or your container will go. So if I look at the documentation here, and because I want to deploy it on vSphere environment, and I can see that there is few prerequisites that I need to meet before I can start doing that, right? So that's where Merlin comes into picture. So it's a Docker-based utility tool. It's open source, and it's not officially VMware release. It's something that I created to help my life a little bit easier. What this one is all about is it encapsulates all those dependencies that TCE needs, and put it inside a Docker container, and it also automates. It has got automation scripts inside it that will give the end user a guided experience of deploying TCE management cluster and workload cluster. So let's see how that looks like. Okay. So first things first, I will So first things first, let's have a look at my vSphere environment that I have. So it's very simple cluster that I have in here, and it has got 4 ESXi hosts, vSAN capability, and I have already and a few other things in there. So in order to, and it's in a private cluster scenario, right? So I don't have direct access from my local machine to. So what I have is a Bastion host or a jump host, whatever you want to call this. So that's this VM here. So I will SSH into this VM to interact with this cluster. So let's start the process. Let's do it. So one of the thing that we need to do if we are deploying TCE on on vSphere environment is have the networking capability, right? And that's where I used NSX-ALB, which is another networking tool set from VMware. So I've already gone ahead and deployed that, and I have made a video about it. So if you missed that, please watch that video of how to deploy NSX-ALB for Tanzu Kubernetes. So in this one, I will focus on deploying TCE Kubernetes. And it started. I'll focus on deploying TCE Kubernetes using Merlin, and there are basically two steps to this, right? So one is to deploy the management cluster, and the other one is to deploy or create TCE workload cluster. Okay, so that's why this controller exists, the NSX-ALB controller, and I can access it through the NSX-ALB console. See if I quickly log in. My super secret password. And if I quickly go into the network section, there are 3 networks that I actually configured. One is the management network, so that's where this controller is running, or the cluster is on. Then there is front ends, and there is workload. So front end is responsible for opening up Kubernetes API endpoints and Kubernetes service type load balancer. So the IPs will come from this range, right? And the workload is where Kubernetes nodes will get their IP addresses from. So it will make sense when we'll go through the TCE deployment UI, and I'll explain along the way. All right, so let's do it. So the first things first, I will go get Merlin, right? But before I do that, because as I mentioned, my cluster is in a private cluster scenario, and I have a jump host to interact with this cluster, which is this guy here. So I will SSH into the jump host first. So grab the IP address, the public IP address of the SSH host, or the exposed IP address, not the public IP address. So I'll do SSH, that's my username, and I believe my IP address is. Okay, so my exposed IP address is not this one. Is this one here. So I've got a VPN connection to that IP address, and I'll do a login to that. Okay, so now that I am logged in that environment, so I've SSH into that. Now let's go get TCE. Let's go get Merlin. So go to Merlin's index page, and so I have the URL here anyway, so I'll use that one. There are other Merlin tools as well, but in this particular case, I'm going to use this one, which is the same URL as the other one, as I mentioned in here. Okay. So getting Merlin actually means just cloning or downloading this repository. So quickly go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've got Merlin TKG there. The other thing before I actually start looking at what this one is talking about is just in case I want to avoid the whole sudo docker scenario, so I'll just add my docker, my current user to the docker group, so I can avoid running sudo each time I'll try to do docker run. So I'll execute this command. So that will give the current user the permission to run docker without sudo, because Merlin is essentially a docker container, right? The other thing I'll do is perform a docker login, and this is to avoid the Docker Hub's rate or request limiting issue. Okay, so I had already logged in before. Okay, so that's all done, and now I can start looking into what Merlin is talking about. Okay. All right, so it's saying git clone this. I've done this. Cd into the directory. So I'll do that. Cd into this directory. Then follow the instruction as below. Docker machines. Yes, I have. So that's saying one of the prereqs of running Merlin is the machine needs to have Docker EE or Docker CE installed on it, which I have already. Then the binaries that I need, so I'm deploying TCE in this case. So I'll go get the TCE binaries. Okay. So in here, and I will use version 019 today. There is a latest version available there, that's okay, but I will use version 019. And I will also need to have the OVA file on my environment. Okay, so what Merlin has instructed me is to get the Tanzu Community Edition, so which is this file here. So I'll get the Linux. I'll download the Linux one. So I'm here. What I will do is go -L. Okay, so it will download the file, the binaries, and the other one I will also need alongside Tanzu CLI is the node's OVA image, right? So that's what I will get it from here. So this location, which I will open in my cluster. Okay, so for this distribution, I will get the latest one, which is this image here, and it will, like, the wizard will actually, or the installation process will actually will tell me which OVA image it is. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded this in my folder, which is this one here, and I'm going to use that one in my vSphere cluster. So I will deploy that OVA file first. Accept devices, that's all good. Select the storage, I need to deploy it. And the NIC card, so just in case, I will say the OVA's NIC 0 will get its network from the K8s workload. And I've already explained what that is in my NSXLD video. Okay, so in a short moment, the OVA file will get, the OVA template will get deployed. So it's in the process of getting uploaded and onto the vSphere cluster. So while that's process completed, let's let's revisit what's the status of our file, the Tanzu CLI download, which is completed as well. So I've downloaded that, and the next instruction is place it into the binaries directory. Right. So I'll just move that file onto binaries directory. Okay, done. The second thing, it is asking me to run this command, which is essentially an environment variable file. So I'll do that, and if I open that file, there are a few things in there, right? So one, because I'm deploying it on a vSphere cluster or vCenter cluster or VMware, so the cloud value is vSphere. Bastion host, I don't need to mention anything, although I am on a Bastion, I am using a Bastion host, but I'm actually on the Bastion host itself, so I don't need to mention Bastion host. Here, the Docker Hub username and password, I need to supply that, which I will do it in a bit. This one, this email address is actually used for creating a SSH key pair. So it doesn't have to be a real email address. In that case, I'll just use admin@cluster.local just to identify which KPI it is. The bind address. Now this one, because I'm on a Bastion host already, and I need to access the CLI, the stuff that will run inside the CLI. So what Tanzu will do, it will initiate a web browser from there. So so I need the IP address of the CLI VM, which is this IP address here. Again, you may not need this unless your setup is exactly the same as mine, right? So most likely in private cluster scenario, if you're going to a jump host and you're running Merlin on the jump host, so you may need to bind the IP address there. So that's pretty much it. So I will do that now, and we're running on port 8080. Okay, so I'm not running on AWS, so I'll delete this. And finally, the Docker Hub username and password, right? So I'll start filling this one out. I'll pause the video and fill this one out and save the file and then come back to it. Okay, so I have now saved that environment file. What else I need to do? Yeah, so I'm ready to run. So I'll execute this command. I'll just give it permissions. Done. And then just need to start it. So before I did that, before I kickstart Merlin, I'll see like what's the status of my OVA upload. So go here. Looks like the upload, the OVA deployment has completed. So the next thing I need to do here is make it a template. And that's it. So now it will appear in here as a template. So that part is done. All looking good. So now I can just kickstart Merlin. Okay, so I'll just do /start, and it will say the default container name is going to be Merlin TKG because I haven't supplied one. And we'll download the necessary images, like the source image and everything. So it will build the image and it will run the container. Right? So I'll pause the video and I'll come back to it once this container creation process is complete. Okay, so this is nearly complete. So what it's doing is actually installing all the dependencies within the container. So none of this is getting installed on the local machine, right? So it's all getting installed inside the container. So it will detect what binary that I have supplied, which is the Tanzu Community Edition binary, and it will also install that. So it kind of detects the environment that it's running on and it adjusts itself according to that. So now it's installing one of the TCE dependencies, which is the Carvel tools. And it's going to download the necessary files that it needs to run. And then it detected that it's the Tanzu CLI and it's the community edition. So it found the and it installed the community edition. So it's installing it now. That's it. So it installed the dependencies. So that's pretty much everything in terms of prerequisites in this documentation talks about. So when it says getting started, so it's plan your deployment, deploy manage cluster and all that kind of scenarios. So it has done all of that automatically. That's the Merlin CLI. So now I have a couple of, I'll just execute the help function to see what options do I have. So one of the options is deploy management cluster, and the other one is deploy workload cluster. So as I mentioned before, is the first step is to deploy the management cluster, which is, so this is me, this is, and step one, I need to deploy the management cluster. So I'm going to instruct Merlin to use Tanzu CLI to start the deployment of management cluster. Okay, so if I do Merlin management cluster deploy, it will generate the key value pair, and that key value pair will come into handy once we get into the deployment of management cluster. So now it's telling me like it kickstarted the UI on this URL. So this is the binding IP address that I gave in the environment variable before. It may all seem a little bit magical or like it's not well explained, but once you actually go through this process, it will make much more sense. Okay. So I have, this is the UI for deploying or installing management cluster for Tanzu Community Edition. Right. So I'll choose the environment, which is vSphere environment, and that's the URL for the vCenter server or the vCenter. So that's this URL here. I'll supply the username and password for it. And I'll do connect. And then it should be able to detect the data centers available there. Now it's asking for the SSH public key, right? So that's what Merlin was doing, generating that SSH key here. And it has said this is your public key. So I'm just going to copy this public key and paste it in here. And there's a reason why this public key is asked, right? I'll explain all of that in a separate video. I'm going to go with the development cluster. That's okay. I could have gone with production, which will deploy 3 control plane node for the management cluster, but I'll keep this demonstration very minimum. So I'll just use 1 control plane node, which will come out of the development cluster. So TCE management, so I'll just name, and I'm using NSX advanced load balancer. The IP address is optional, so basically if I don't give any, it will just pick one from the range that I have provided before. So one from here, from this range. Most likely it's going to be the first IP address of this range. Okay, so I'm not going to pick one there, and the worker node will be size medium. I'll enable audit logging. Now the advanced load balancer config, right? So first things first, I need to connect with their QDN and give my username and password, and then controller certificate authority. So this is something I had done during the deployment of NSXLB. Please watch my other video for explanation on why I did that. So for now, I'll just use the certificate. I'll do verify credential. So it's verified. So that means it was able to connect successfully. It finds what cloud it's going to connect to. So I only have 1 cloud. I only have 1 service engine group. Now it's going to say, well, what's your workload VIP network name? right? So uh, the term here is a little bit confusing. When I saw it first time, I was like, okay, is it workload network or is it front-end network? This is actually the front-end network. And the reason for this is this one is essentially asking for is when you deploy a container or a workload onto your Kubernetes workload cluster or Kubernetes cluster, what would be the network where it will get the IP address from, right? So in our case, that network is front end, right? And the IP address is this range. The network CIDR is this range, which is already configured, as I showed before. It's configured in this section, right? So this network here, and that's the VIP range. Okay. The other thing it's asking for is the management VIP. Now, this means where it's asking for where would the management cluster get its endpoint from, and the diagram that I showed in the when I deployed the NSX ALB, I explained that in my case, the way I am implementing, they're both on the same network. So I'm choosing K8s front-end in this case. But I could have been dedicated a separate set of subnet for this purpose, for the management plane to be in. So I'll go next. Metadata, I'll skip this one. VM folder. And the data is stored. So that's the resources part. And because I don't have a resource pool that I created, but if I had created a resource pool, that should have showed up in here. So in this case, I'm just going to select the region as the resource pool, and then the CNI, the Container Network Interface Provider. So by default, it uses Antria, but that can also be changed. And then the network name. So this is the workload. So this is the node's network name, right? So as I was saying, according to my setup earlier, I have said that the node's network will get their IP addresses from this Kubernetes workload. So that's the range. So that's what I'm mentioning in here. Hey, TCE Kubernetes, you get the node's network. Your node network is this network here. And this is service CIDR. So when I declare a service type cluster IP, the CIDR is this. Kubernetes itself runs a bunch of services in itself, so it needs to know a CIDR range. This is the default value, so you can always configure it. But I tend to keep it the default way because it's very unlikely that I'll ever interact at this networking level. So, and the pod CIDR, so obviously the pods will get IP address from here, and there will be networking connection established between the node and pod. So that's why it's exposing these details. So that's all good. And at this point, I actually don't have an identity provider for authentication, so I'm just going to use the admin identity for it. So I'll disable it for now, but in a later video, I'll explain exactly how I can integrate Tanzu Kubernetes cluster with an external identity provider like Azure AD or through Keycloak or something similar. So that's done. The OS image, remember that in that OVA template that we uploaded earlier? So that's what shows up in here. So I need to select this one because that's the OS image of the nodes. So the Kubernetes nodes that it's going to provision, those nodes or those VMs will be based off of this OS image. That's done. Reset TMC. I don't have TMC at this point, so I will not register anything. But this is a topic I'll cover in a future video. EV configuration. Yeah, I've done everything right. So I'll just do deploy management cluster, and then things kicks off. So it will do a lot of things. It will go through all of this installation process, and I'll let it run its course. And when this process finishes, I'll pause the video, and when this process finishes, I'll come back to it. Okay, so the installation step is almost at its last stage. So let's head over to our console and see what's happening there. So this is the console, this is the command prompt where we kicked off this installation. So the logs are also available here, by the way. So I could monitor either here or here. I just like to monitor it in here because that shows me the steps that is being completed. Right. I think a few more seconds and we'll be done. Okay, so the installation process has finished. Now let's have a look at what it has actually done in our environment. So let's first look at the vCenter. So you can see like it has deployed 2 nodes with the name TCE management as we provided for the management cluster name, and it had created 1 control plane node, 1 worker node. Right, so that's there. The second thing it has done in the networking space is, if we go into application section, you can see that it has provisioned a virtual service. So that's the API endpoint for the management cluster. And let's have a look at the IP. So as we suspected, that it has taken the first IP available from that range. And then there's this virtual services which is listening on port 643. By default, that's what it listens to. And it has also created a pool. So that's in the RV side of things, or the NSX ALB side of things. Right? And then if we head over to our console, in Merlin command prompt, we can see what's happening here is it completed the management cluster deployment process, and then Merlin has gone ahead and done some reconciliation to figure out like what's the name of the management console, right? Of the management control plane, management cluster. Sorry. So I would say, and it's asking us this: is this correct? Is this what you have supplied? And I'm going to say yes. So then it configures the config file behind the scene, and now our environment is ready for deploying a Kubernetes cluster onto the vCenter environment. That's what we're going to do next. Okay, so now that the management cluster is deployed, and we had a look like what that looks like in our environment, let's do a quick recap what we actually have done. So if we look at our instruction set, so we had prepare our Docker environment on like the Docker environment on the host machine. So that's done. We got the Merlin from Git repo. We downloaded the TCE CLI and gave it to Merlin. We uploaded the OS OVA onto the vSphere cluster, and we launched management cluster deployment using Merlin. Right, and then that resulted in the management cluster and deploy management cluster through UI, right? Or I should say GUI. So now that's all done. And the next topic on my agenda is to deploy a workload cluster using Merlin. So in order to do that, let's have a quick look what Merlin can give us. So I'll just do help, and there's a workload cluster UI that I can kick off, right? So let's do that. Merlin, oops, workload cluster. Workload. Okay, so it's asking for cluster name. So we'll say this is our, cluster 01. Okay, let's call this one. Then it's saying it detected the cluster config file, and it's saying should we use it? I'll say yes, go for it. It's going to use that as a default value provider, and it detected that the cloud is vSphere. Done, and it detected that I am running NSXALB as my networking component. So yes, I'll accept that. And what level of details I'd like to configure for Kubernetes nodes. So I'll keep it simple. I'll stick with basic. On advanced, like it will expose features like how much volume do I need for the node, and so on. Would I like to do autoscaler for this one? I'll avoid it because I'm going to do a very simple deployment. Private repository, I don't have a private repository yet. I'll make a separate video touching specific, going into details to the specifics, right? Configure proxy, no. And then cluster plan. So again, I'll deploy a development cluster because the workload cluster will trigger off, 3 nodes, 3 control plane nodes, and 3 worker nodes. So I'll stick with dev for now. Cluster CID, I'll accept the default values. And it has detected like what is the OS that I use. So I'll stick with Photon. The version for Photon is going to be 3. So these things are actually documented, right? The Merlin's UI is just simplifying it for me with a hint of like what does it actually means. So this way, what it's doing behind the scene is actually generating the declarative YAML file that that I referred to earlier. Worker machine count, I'll say 2. Okay. Entria, that's okay. And the rest of it is just going to take the default value. vSphere insecure? No, because I can do verify thumbprint, right? That's okay. And the resource pool. So I have not created a separate resource pool yet, so I'll accept the one that is already there, which is directly under the region. So the control plane size. So I've got options like small, medium, large, and so on, right? So in this case, I'll select a small one. That's okay. And the worker node, I'll select a small again. And now it has finished generating a cluster file, right? So it's asking me whether I'll be able to verify it, right? Which I can. So that file is actually in the jump host or the Bastion host, right? So I'll just SSH into the Bastion host. It would have been much easier, like if if I had a direct connection to my cluster from my local machine, which I don't, which makes things getting onto the jump host to interact with the file system. But that's okay. It's not too bad. Okay, and I'll go to where I downloaded Merlin. So go to in that directory. If I do an ls, I should be able to see there's a workload cluster folder. So that's where Merlin would create the declarative YAML file. So if I do a less on workload cluster, there should only be that YAML file that we are talking about. So it has completed generating that YAML file. So this is what I was referring to as the declarative YAML in this diagram, right? So now as a operator, I'm creating a Kubernetes cluster using that declarative YAML file. So the Merlin's UI it's just guided me through that declaration process. That's pretty much it. So I'll say yes, everything looks good. Go ahead, and now it will kick off the deployment of the workload cluster. Right. This process takes a little bit of time, so I'll pause the video and I'll come back to it once the cluster is deployed. Okay, so the cluster creation process is now completed as per our declarative definition in the YAML file. So if I do Tanzu cluster list, that's the cluster that we that just got created. So let's have a quick look. Let's have a quick look at our at the vCenter level, like what happened there. So if I jump to my vSphere console, then that's the cluster 01 we just created, right? So one control plane, two worker node, and we can see the size and the IP address are getting assigned from the K8s workload space. If I go to the NSX ALD control plane, then I can see that there is a second set of virtual service that got created. Okay, we'll go to virtual services. So that's the IP that it's received. So that's the endpoint that the cluster is listening to. Okay, so that's all good now. The last thing I want to quickly show here is how do I get access to that cluster, right? So kubectl ns. Let's see which cluster it's actually pointing to. So I think this is pointing to the management cluster at this point. So if I go kubectl config get contexts, okay, so I can see that it's pointing to the management cluster. So I need to bring in the workload cluster to it. So in order to do that, I can run this command, which is workload cluster name, and the workload cluster name is cluster 01. And now I have the cluster context created in my keep-config file. And if I use that context, so now I switch context to that, and I can run the kubectl command again. So now there is two contexts there, and currently it's pointing at the workload cluster. And so if I do kubectl get ns, I should be able to see the work, the context of the workload cluster, so the default namespace. All the namespaces that are there. At the moment, it's an empty cluster, so there's nothing deployed there. In the next video, I will focus more on to deploying some containers on this cluster. So everything that we did in this demonstration is all documented in the Tanzu Community Edition documentation section, and that's the vSphere documentation, the deployment of management cluster. Merlin just made it a little bit automated with all of this process involved. Right? And the workload cluster is creation of workload cluster, the deployment, the declarative definition of the cluster is also documented here. So that's pretty much it. So let's recap what we had just done in our document. So using Merlin guided guided UI, we just created a workload cluster. So that process is also completed. That concludes my demo today. The last thing I will do is actually exit this Docker container. So basically, I just want to show where the kubeconfig file is, so which is actually in this directory. So as I was running inside the Docker, so Docker had its own environment, right? And the kube directory is here. So if I look at the kubeconfig file, so that's the kubeconfig file there. Okay. All right. And I'll exit out of the SSH location as well. That's it. Thank you.